that they're going to look at Carlos and what he does and how he loves to be aggressive and move forward, because we lost a lot of that. You don't see the volleying that much, but I think that's going to change because of him.
Carlos Alcaraz just became the youngest career Grand Slam winner in history at the 2026 Australian Open. Clay season opens today at Monte Carlo. And somewhere between those two facts, John McEnroe, 7 Grand Slam titles, 5 decades inside this sport, quietly dropped a verdict that the tennis world is still unpacking. He didn't just call Alcaraz talented or rank him among the greats. McEnroe sat down and revealed that Carlos Alcaraz possesses something, a specific, nameable gift, that across 50 years of watching this sport at the highest level, he has never seen in any player at this age.
Hey, this guy's got some talent. That guy's pretty quick out there. I never in my wildest dreams, I'll tell you, of all the players I've ever watched, at this age, I've never seen a player this good, this complete.
Borg, Sampras, Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, none of them qualified. That statement didn't come from nowhere. It came after watching Alcaraz do something at the Laver Cup, the French Open, and the US Open that genuinely stopped McEnroe mid-sentence. A man famously hard to impress, sitting courtside in San Francisco, openly admitting he was jealous of what he was watching. The question worth asking is, what exactly did McEnroe see that 40-plus years of tennis couldn't prepare him for? If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because the answer changes how you watch Alcaraz entirely.
Novak, because he's pushing the ceiling higher and higher and putting the bar up higher and higher. At 38, I mean, Carlos Alcaraz is such an unbelievable athlete that I would assume that he could be playing for at least another 15 years.
Youngest to have ever done it by a couple of years, edging out Rafa. And then after Rafa, it jumps too. It's not as if there's like Rafa and then there's like 3 people close like within a year.
So let's go to San Francisco, September 19th, 2025, the Laver Cup, Chase Center. McEnroe is sitting at the Tennis Channel desk with Steve Weissman and John Wertheim, no longer a captain, no longer competing, just a man with half a century of tennis memory watching the sport he shaped take a direction he genuinely didn't expect. Someone asks him what makes Alcaraz special. His immediate response is a laugh. How much time do we got? Which tells you something on its own, because McEnroe doesn't do sentiment easily. He does opinion, he does argument. He does precision. And when a man built like that laughs before answering, it usually means the answer is genuinely difficult to compress. What came next was the full sweep. He went through Rod Laver, his idol, the man he grew up watching and measuring everything against. Then his own era, Borg, Connors, Lendl, the 3 rivals who shaped him as a player and, arguably, made him who he was. Then the generation after, Becker, Edberg, Agassi, Sampras, names McEnroe acknowledged with genuine respect, men who pushed the sport forward in ways that seemed impossible at the time. And then the big 3, Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, the 3 greatest players who ever lived, by McEnroe's own assessment, a trio he felt genuinely fortunate to witness from the commentary desk. And after all of that, 50 years of accumulated watching, competing, analyzing, McEnroe landed on one sentence. Of all the players I've ever watched, at this age, I've never seen a player this good and this complete. That word, complete. It's the one that keeps appearing every time McEnroe discusses Alcaraz, and it's the one that deserves the most careful examination, because it isn't a synonym for talented or dominant or even great. Completeness in tennis terms means something structurally specific. It means there is no obvious weapon to take away, no surface to exploit, no tactical blueprint that reliably works. Most champions, even the legendary ones, carried an identifiable limitation at some stage. Federer's backhand was a target early in his career, Nadal on fast indoor hard courts, Djokovic's serve for stretches of his development. These weren't weaknesses that defined them. They were human gaps that opponents could locate and plan around. McEnroe's claim about Alcaraz is that at 22 years old, those gaps simply don't exist at a level anyone can reliably exploit. And the evidence backing that up is more concrete than most people realize. In 2025, Alcaraz was the only man in the entire sport to record more than 1,000 winners across the major events combined, finishing the Grand Slams with 1,035.
simply has just walked into the conversation with the best of all time. There's only so many people on earth that can walk around and say to any Grand Slam venue and be like, oh, I won here too. The youngest to have ever done it by a couple of years, edging out Rafa. And then after Rafa jumps too. It's not as if there's like Rafa and then there's like three people close like within a year.
To understand why that number matters specifically in this conversation, consider what it takes to generate winners from every area of the court: baseline, mid-court, net, off both wings, from defensive positions, from offensive ones. Winners aren't just power, they're decision-making, variety, and execution converging at the same moment. That total wasn't a product of one dominant shot, it was the statistical footprint of a player who can end points in too many different ways for opponents to contain. By June 2025 at Wimbledon, Alcaraz had won 27 of his first 30 grass court matches, a winning percentage that surpassed every former or current world number one in the Open era on that surface, including Federer at 19-11, Djokovic at 22-8, and McEnroe himself at 24-6. The man praising Alcaraz's completeness has his own name in that comparison, sitting behind the player he's describing. That's not a small detail. And then there is the net play, the element McEnroe returns to with a consistency that reveals genuine personal investment. At Wimbledon 2025, Alcaraz served and volleyed more than any other quarterfinalist in the draw, winning 61 of 77 net approach points, a success rate of 79% against a tournament average of 67%. In an era where serve and volley accounts for just 4% of points across the men's game, down from 60% in 1997, Alcaraz is using it as a primary weapon and winning with it at an elite rate. This is precisely what McEnroe was pointing at in San Francisco when he said the sport had lost something and that Alcaraz was about to give it back. A man who built his career at the net, who watched the entire serve and volley era dissolve into baseline dominance across the 2000s and 2010s, watching a 22-year-old bring it back not as a novelty, but as a structurally sound match-winning strategy. McEnroe was jealous, yes, but underneath the jealousy was something closer to relief. The second element McEnroe named, and the one that generates the most interesting conversation, is the smile. McEnroe called it the biggest thing when describing what separates Alcaraz from everyone he's observed across those 50 years. Not the forehand, not the speed, not the drop shot or the net approach or the serve improvement that Samuel Lopez oversaw during the 2026 preseason. The smile. To someone watching from the outside, that sounds like a compliment about personality rather than tennis. But McEnroe, who famously competed with visible fury, who expressed his own emotions on court in ways that defined an era and cost him matches, understood precisely what he was describing. He called the ability to compete with genuine joy so hard to do, and he would know because he spent his entire career trying and largely failing to find that internal state during matches. What McEnroe identified is a competitive psychological architecture that almost nobody at the elite level manages to sustain.
You know, we keep wondering if is there going to be anybody else? That question still is not answered.
Feels like we'd seen the end of that kind of Carlos Alcaraz.
They're going to look at Carlos and what he does.
Pressure at the Grand Slam level is designed to strip enjoyment away. Every important match, particularly against the best opponents, arrives loaded with consequence, ranking implications, historical significance, the weight of expectation. The standard response to that weight is tension, contraction, the narrowing of shot selection that comes when the margin for error feels impossibly small. Alcaraz responds differently. When Alcaraz was asked at a press conference whether he smiles because he's winning or wins because he's smiling, his answer was immediate and unambiguous. I am winning all the time because I'm smiling. Smiling for me is the key of everything. He wasn't being modest or performing humility. He was describing a genuine internal relationship with competition that McEnroe spent his career searching for and never fully found. The 2025 French Open final is the clearest illustration of this on record. Down 2 sets to love against Jannik Sinner, facing 3 championship points in the 4th set, in what became the longest final in Roland Garros history at 5 hours and 29 minutes, Alcaraz won 14 of the final 17 points. The Guardian described it as one of the greatest finals ever played in any sport. At the moment of maximum pressure, Alcaraz's response was not to tighten. It was to open up.
Alcaraz badly wanted to win, wanted to come out and penetrate the court enough, and he has that kind of confidence in his game.
On a legendary career already.
I think Alcaraz definitely got room for improvement.
It feels like we had seen the end of that kind of Carlos Alcaraz.
Here is where McEnroe's observation connects to something structurally important about why this gift specifically is unprecedented across 5 decades of watching. The players McEnroe spent those 50 years observing generally fell into one of 2 competitive profiles at the elite level. There were the emotionally explosive competitors, McEnroe himself, Connors, Borg in a different way, Djokovic, players who channeled pressure into aggression, who used emotional intensity as fuel. And there were the technically supreme ones, the architects, Federer, Sampras, who managed pressure through aesthetic control, through making the game look easier than it was. Alcaraz doesn't fit either profile cleanly, and that appears to be exactly what McEnroe couldn't categorize across 50 years. The Spaniard is emotionally expressive on court, genuinely reactive, visibly affected by big moments, but those moments produce joy rather than fury, openness rather than rigidity. Chris Evert, covering the 2025 French Open for TNT Sports, put it differently, but arrived at a similar place. He plays with a permanent smile on his face, a permanent smile off the court as well. He is there to entertain. I personally think he likes to entertain himself with these shots. That last observation, entertaining himself, is perhaps the most telling phrase in any analysis of Alcaraz. It suggests a player whose internal experience of competing remains genuinely pleasurable even at the sport's highest stakes. That is not something McEnroe had seen before. It is not something most tennis observers had articulated before McEnroe named it. The revolution McEnroe predicted at the Laver Cup is already visible across the tour. Ahead of the 2026 Miami Open, Jack Draper stated plainly that top players including Medvedev and Zverev have had to fundamentally change how they approach points because the old conservative baseline style simply doesn't hold up against what Alcaraz brings. Draper wasn't describing a stylistic preference. He was describing a structural necessity, that an entire generation of elite professionals has been forced to rebuild their tactical approach because one player's completeness left them with no other option. McEnroe had said exactly this would happen. At the Laver Cup, he spoke directly about running his own tennis academy in New York, about watching young players spend 15 years trying to emulate the baseline dominance of the Big Three era, and about his hope that Alcaraz would redirect that instinct. I'm hoping that they're going to look at Carlos and what he does, how he loves to be aggressive and move forward, because we've lost a lot of that. That wasn't wishful thinking. In September 2025, by the spring of 2026, it was already the observable reality across the tour. The full picture of what McEnroe revealed carries one more layer that tends to get lost in the headline version of his Laver Cup comments. The praise isn't simply about what Alcaraz has done. It is about the combination of what he has done and how young he still is. 7 Grand Slam titles, youngest career Grand Slam winner in history, world number 1 across 2 separate stretches of his career before the age of 23. The only man to win multiple Grand Slam titles on all 3 surfaces before turning 23. A 2026 season that opened with an Australian Open title won in the most physically demanding semi-final in Melbourne's history, 5 hours and 27 minutes against Zverev, followed immediately by a Qatar Open title won in the fastest completed final of his career at 50 minutes against Fils. That range within a single season alone speaks to the completeness McEnroe was identifying. And yet, by every available statistical and developmental measure, Alcaraz is still improving. Analysis of his 2026 season through the early months showed measurable gains in his 2 historically weakest areas. Backhand shot quality moving from 7.8 to 8.8, and return games from 7.4 to 8.3. The areas where McEnroe saw gaps were the areas Alcaraz closed first. The player McEnroe described as complete at 22 is working to become more complete at 23. After the 2026 Australian Open, McEnroe told El País something that summarized his position more concisely than any long quote could. When asked whether he would consider a coaching role with Alcaraz following the Ferrero split, McEnroe said, "I don't know how far I would really have anything to tell them." A 7-time Grand Slam champion, one of the most analytically precise voices the sport has produced, effectively acknowledging that the player he has watched for 5 decades has moved beyond the territory where his own experience provides clear instruction. That is what the gift actually is. It isn't one shot or one quality or one statistical category. It is the convergence of completeness, forward aggression, joy under pressure, and a pace of development that leaves even the sport's greatest observers searching for new language. McEnroe watched tennis for 50 years before he found it. The fact that he found it in a 22-year-old from Murcia who smiles through 5-hour finals and serves and volleys in an era that declared the tactic dead, that is the part worth sitting with as clay season begins today at Monte Carlo. If this gave you a different way of looking at what Alcaraz is actually doing on a tennis court, share it with someone who watches the sport, because this conversation is only going to get bigger as Roland Garros approaches. Subscribe if you haven't already, drop a comment with where you think the ceiling actually is for Alcaraz, and we'll see you in the next one.